Welcome to my Channel Deep Sleep Mission-DSM. As we begin, I would be delighted if you could share your location in the comments below. It's truly inspiring to witness how far this content travels and to connect with viewers from across the world. The first time I heard Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major playing from my grandmother's piano at 3 in the morning. I was standing in my kitchen, drinking water, and the piano lid was closed. I know what you're thinking. Old house, thin walls, neighbor's kid practicing late. But here's the thing, my nearest neighbor lives half a mile away. And that piano, it hasn't been tuned in 15 years. Before you click away, let me ask you something. What would you do if the music started playing your deepest, most private thoughts? The melodies you hum when you think no one's listening? Because that's exactly what happened to me. And I need to know if I'm losing my mind, or if something far worse is happening. Now, let me tell you the whole story from the beginning. My grandmother passed away on a Tuesday. It was one of those gray October mornings in Portland, Oregon, where the rain doesn't quite fall but hangs in the air like unspoken grief. She left me her Victorian house on Hawthorne Street, along with everything in it, including that massive Steinway grand piano that dominated her living room like a sleeping giant. I'd spent every summer there as a kid, learning scales on those yellowed keys while she hummed along from the kitchen, making her famous blackberry pie. The house smelled like vanilla extract and old sheet music, a combination that still makes my chest tight with nostalgia. But I hadn't played in years. Life got busy, you know. Corporate job at Nike headquarters, mortgage on a condo downtown. The usual excuses we tell ourselves when we abandon the things we love. Moving in felt wrong at first, like wearing someone else's clothes. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. Her reading glasses still perched on the piano bench. A half-finished crossword puzzle on the coffee table. Tuesday, October 15th, 4 across. Eternal rest. The answer was sleep, written in her shaky handwriting. That first night, I ordered Thai food from that place on Division Street and ate it straight from the container. Sitting on her plastic-covered sofa, the house creaked and settled around me, making those old house sounds that you tell yourself are normal. The piano sat there, lid closed, like a coffin in the corner of the room. I should have sold it. Looking back now, I should have called Morrison's music shop on Burnside and had them haul it away. But something stopped me. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was sentiment. Or maybe, just maybe, it was already too late. The first week passed without incident. I threw myself into organizing her things, donating clothes to Goodwill, sorting through photo albums filled with sepia-toned strangers. I avoided the living room, and, by extension, the piano. It felt like a presence watching me through the polished black wood. Then came that night. 2 weeks after I'd moved in, I'd been having trouble sleeping, tossing and turning in her old 4-poster bed. The antique clock in the hallway ticked too loudly. Each second felt like a heartbeat. Around 3 a.m., I gave up and padded downstairs for water. The kitchen was at the back of the house, past the living room. I didn't turn on the lights. I knew the way by feel. Muscle memory from all those childhood summers. The old hardwood floors were cold under my bare feet. I was filling a glass at the sink when I heard it. Soft at first, like someone was playing with the damper pedal down. Those opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne, the one every piano student learns. But there was something off about it. The timing was perfect, too perfect, like a music box, mechanical and precise. I froze, water overflowing from my glass, running cold over my fingers. The music continued, note by haunting note. I set the glass down with shaking hands and crept toward the living room. My heart hammered against my ribs. In the doorway, I stopped. The piano sat in darkness, lid closed. bench tucked neatly underneath. But the music kept playing, muffled, as if coming from inside the instrument itself. I flicked on the lights. Nothing. Just the piano, silent now, looking exactly as it had for the past 2 weeks. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, waiting, listening. Just the tick of the hallway clock and my own ragged breathing. I told myself I dreamed it. Stress from the move, grief playing tricks. I went back to bed and eventually fell into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I almost convinced myself it hadn't happened. Almost. But when I went to make coffee, I found my water glass on the counter, still full, a puddle spreading across the granite where it had overflowed. 3 nights later, it happened again. This time, I was ready. I'd bought one of those sleep apps on my phone, the kind that's supposed to track your REM cycles. I told myself I was being scientific about it, rational if I was sleepwalking, or having auditory hallucinations. I'd have proof. At 3:17 a.m., my phone buzzed. The app had detected sound. I lay perfectly still, every muscle tensed. There it was, faint but unmistakable. Not Chopin this time, but something else, something I recognized but couldn't quite place. I grabbed my phone and crept downstairs, recording everything. The music grew louder as I approached the living room. It was a simple melody, almost like a lullaby. Then it hit me, and my blood turned to ice water. It was the song I had been humming in the shower that morning. A made-up tune. Something that had been stuck in my head for no reason. Something that had never been written down, never been played. Something that existed only in my mind. Until now. The piano was playing my thoughts. I stood in the doorway, phone held out like a shield. The lid was still closed, but I could see it now, a faint vibration in the wood. The strings inside were moving, I was sure of it. "Hello?" My voice cracked like a teenager's. "Is someone there?" The music stopped mid-note. The silence that followed was worse than any sound. It felt expectant, like something was listening, waiting. I forced myself to walk to the piano. My bare feet made no sound on the carpet. With trembling fingers, I reached for the lid. "Sarah?" I screamed and spun around. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, stood in my front doorway, which I'd apparently left unlocked. She was wearing a pink bathrobe and rubber boots, her gray hair in curlers. "I saw your lights on," she said, clutching her chest. "Lord, child, you scared me as much as I scared you. Is everything all right?" I explained about the music, trying not to sound insane. She gave me that look, the one people give you when they think you're having a breakdown. "Honey, you've been through a lot." She patted my shoulder. "Your grandmother's passing. The move. Sometimes grief makes us hear things. When my Robert died, I heard his voice calling me for months. She stayed for tea, and by the time she left, I'd almost believed her. Grief, stress, auditory hallucinations. It made sense. But when I played back the recording on my phone, it was only static. The next few days, I threw myself into research. I Googled everything. Pianos playing by themselves, haunted instruments, auditory hallucinations, grief. Most of it was garbage. Ghost stories and creepypasta, but I found a few scientific articles about musical ear syndrome. Where people hear phantom music, it's usually caused by hearing loss or isolation. I made an appointment with my doctor, scheduled a hearing test, started taking melatonin for sleep. I even called a piano tuner, thinking maybe the strings were just settling in the old house, creating resonance. The tuner came on a Thursday. His name was Marcus, a tall man with calloused fingers who'd been servicing pianos in Portland for 30 years. He recognized my grandmother's Steinway immediately. "Beautiful instrument," he said. running his hand along the closed lid. 1912 Model B. They don't make them like this anymore. Your grandmother had me out here. Oh, must have been 2009, 2010. She mentioned it hadn't been tuned since then. I said. He frowned. That can't be right. I was here just last year. Last year, but she said. He pulled out a worn notebook and flipped through it. Here we go. October 23rd. Last year, she specifically requested. That's odd. What? He showed me the entry in his neat handwriting. Client requested tuning to 432 Hz instead of standard 440. Claimed it opened doorways. Unusual request but complied. Piano responded strangely. Noted unusual resonance in lower register. Client seemed pleased. Doorways. The word made my skin crawl. Marcus opened the lid, and we both gasped. The strings were covered in what looked like frost. Despite the house being a comfortable 70 degrees, he touched one, and it hummed. A deep vibration I felt in my bones. I've never seen anything like this, he whispered. The strings they're vibrating on their own. Look. He was right, tiny, almost imperceptible movements, like they were breathing. I can't work on this. He packed up his tools quickly. I'm sorry, but I don't know what this is. After he left, I sat on the couch, staring at the piano. The lid was still open, revealing those impossible frost-covered strings. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the room, I could swear I saw shapes in the frost. Musical notes forming and reforming. That night, I didn't wait for 3 a.m.
I set up my laptop on the coffee table, opened a recording program, and pointed my webcam at the piano. If something was going to happen, I wanted proof. At 11:47 p.m., the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees in as many seconds. My breath came out in clouds. The frost on the strings began to glow. A soft blue light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Then the music started. Not one song this time, but dozens. All at once, melodies I'd heard throughout my life, layered and twisted together. The lullaby my mother sang when I was sick, the wedding march from my failed engagement, the hymn from my grandmother's funeral, and underneath it all, that strange humming I'd been doing in the shower, binding them together like a thread. The laptop screen flickered and died. My phone shut off. Even the lights dimmed, as if something was draining all the power from the house. And in that semi-darkness, lit only by those glowing strings, I saw her. My grandmother sat at the piano bench, her back to me. But it wasn't quite her. The edges of her form wavered, like heat mirages on summer asphalt. She was wearing the dress we'd buried her in, that navy blue one with the pearl buttons. Her fingers moved over the keys, but they passed through them, touching something deeper, something underneath. The music coming from the piano wasn't from the strings at all. It was coming from somewhere else, somewhere the strings could only hint at. Grandma? My voice was barely a whisper. She turned, and I bit back a scream. Her face was incomplete, like a portrait someone had started but never finished. Her eyes were just suggestions of eyes, her smile a blur of memory. Sarah. Her voice came from everywhere and nowhere. I've been waiting. Waiting for what? For you to understand. She gestured to the piano. What I discovered. What I've been trying to tell you. The frost on the strings formed words now. Sheet music I couldn't quite read. Notes that hurt to look at. The piano, she continued. It's not an instrument. It's a receiver. And at the right frequency, 432 Hz. It can pick up broadcasts. Broadcasts from where? She smiled. That blurry, uncertain smile. From everyone who's ever played it. Every emotion. Every thought. Every piece of soul we pour into the music. It stays. It accumulates. Like sediment at the bottom of a lake. The music grew louder. I heard my own childhood practicing now. Scales and arpeggios, played with stubby 6-year-old fingers. My teenage years, pounding out angry rock ballads. All of it, preserved. But why show me this, I asked. Why the midnight concerts? Why scare me? Because someone needs to know. Her form was fading now. Someone needs to continue. The piano doesn't just receive. Sarah, with the right music, the right intention, it can transmit. Transmit what? But she was gone. The frost melted instantly, running down the strings like tears. The room temperature returned to normal so fast my ears popped. The lights came back on, blindingly bright. I sat there until dawn, trying to process what I'd seen, trying to rationalize it. Carbon monoxide poisoning? A stroke? A complete psychotic break? But the laptop had recorded everything. The file was corrupted, mostly static, but in the last few seconds, just before the battery died, you could hear it, my grandmother's voice. Clear as day. Play for them. Sarah, play their songs back to them. They need to remember. I should have left, packed my things, sold the house, moved back to my downtown condo, but I didn't. Because that night, after my grandmother's ghost or hallucination or whatever it was had faded, I'd felt something I hadn't felt in years. Purpose. I started playing again. Tentatively at first. Just scales and simple pieces. The piano responded normally during the day. The keys felt familiar under my fingers, like coming home, but I could feel it. Underneath, that strange resonance, that listening quality. I began researching in earnest, not ghost stories this time, but the real history of the house. Property records, old newspapers, my grandmother's journals, which I found in a box in the attic. What I discovered changed everything. The house had been built in 1892 by a man named Theodore Ashford. He was Portland's first piano teacher. Had a studio right here in what was now my living room. Over the decades, hundreds of students had learned on this very piano. My grandmother had bought it with the house in 1963, insisted it stay exactly where Ashford had placed it. But here's where it gets strange. In her journals, my grandmother had documented something she called the remembrance. Starting in 2010, after that unusual tuning, she'd begun hearing the music at night. But not random songs, specific pieces played by specific people. She'd tracked them down. Every single one, Mrs. Eleanor Price, who'd played Claire de Lune in 1947, suffering from dementia in a care home, when my grandmother played the exact rendition back, with all Eleanor's little mistakes and flourishes. The woman had cried. She'd remembered her late husband, her children, entire decades that Alzheimer's had stolen. Timothy Chen, a veteran who'd learned piano here in 1968 before shipping out to Vietnam. He'd been struggling with PTSD for 50 years. My grandmother had played back his hesitant version of Danny Boy. He'd called her the next week, said it was like finding a piece of himself he'd lost in the jungle. Page after page of stories. People who'd lost themselves, forgotten who they were. And my grandmother, playing their memories back to them, helping them remember. But the last entry, dated a week before her death, was different. The piano is getting stronger. It's not just receiving anymore. Last night, I heard Sarah playing, but Sarah hasn't touched a piano in 10 years. It was pulling music from her, from miles away, her sadness, her regret, all those unplayed songs building up inside her. I won't be here much longer. The doctors say weeks, maybe days. But the piano will remain, and Sarah will come. She has to. Because there are so many who need to remember. So many songs trapped in the silence between the notes. The piano doesn't just play music, it plays memories. It plays souls. And someone needs to be here, to play them back, to remind people who they are, who they were, who they could be again. I'm leaving it all to her. The house, the piano, the responsibility. She'll think she's going mad at first, they all do. But she'll understand. She'll remember why she loved music, why it mattered, why it still matters. Play for them. Sarah, play their songs back to them. They need to remember. I closed the journal and looked at the piano. It sat there, patient, waiting. That night, I didn't go to bed. I sat at the bench, hands poised over the keys. At exactly 3:17 a.m., I felt it, the pull, the piano wanting to play. This time, I let it. My fingers moved without my conscious control, playing songs I'd never learned. A waltz from 1923, a jazz piece from 1955, a child's first recital from 1987. Each one perfect, down to every hesitation, every missed note, every surge of emotion. And with each song, I saw them, faint impressions, the people who'd played them, their hopes, their fears, their love poured into every note. I understood then. The piano wasn't haunted. It was alive, alive with every moment of music that had ever passed through it. A repository of human experience, waiting to be shared. I've been here 3 months now, every night. I play, sometimes. I get visitors. People drawn by something they can't explain. They stand in my doorway, tears streaming down their faces, as I play back moments they'd forgotten. First loves, last goodbyes, children's laughter, parents' lullabies. Last week, a woman came from Seattle. She'd driven 3 hours because she couldn't stop thinking about a melody. Her father had learned piano here in 1971. When I played his piece, she collapsed, sobbing. She'd been estranged from him for 20 years. Called him that night. But here's the thing. The piano isn't satisfied with just the past anymore. Lately, I've been hearing new music, songs that haven't been played yet, melodies from people who haven't been born. The piano isn't just a repository. It's a conduit, a bridge between what was, what is, and what could be. And I'm scared. Because last night, I heard something different. It started with the usual music at 3:17, but then, underneath it all, was a new sound, a discordant hum, like static between radio stations. And in that static, I heard voices, thousands of them, all calling out, desperate to be remembered. The piano is evolving, growing stronger. The frost on the strings spreads a little more each night. Soon, it won't need me to play at all. So I'm documenting this, leaving a record, because I don't know what happens next. I don't know if I'll still be me when the frost reaches the keys. All I know is that the music must continue. The memories must be preserved. The songs must be played, even if, especially if, they're no longer entirely human songs. If you're reading this, if you found this account, then maybe you've heard it too. That music in the night. Those melodies that seem familiar but wrong. Those songs that play in houses where no one's touched a piano in years. Don't ignore them. Don't dismiss them as imagination. Listen.
Because somewhere, in an old Victorian on Hawthorne Street in Portland, a piano is playing your song. The song of who you were, who you are, who you might become. And it's waiting for you to remember. The music never stops. It just waits for the right ears to hear it. So tell me, what song do you hear when you close your eyes at night? What melody haunts your quiet moments? Because I can play it for you. I can help you remember. All you have to do is knock on my door at 3:17 a.m. When the frost glows blue on the strings, when the boundary between memory and music grows thin, I'll be waiting at the piano. We'll all be waiting. Wait, do you hear that? That faint melody? I bet if you close your eyes right now, you can almost make it out. Is it a song from your childhood? Something your parent hummed? Or is it something else? Something you've never heard before, but somehow know. Leave a comment below and tell me what music haunts your quiet hours. And if you're ever in Portland, if you ever find yourself on Hawthorne Street at 3 a.m., well, just remember, the piano remembers everything. Subscribe if this story kept you awake. Share if you heard your own song in these words. And whatever you do, don't ignore the music in the night. It's trying to tell you something. Story number 2. The $20 bill in my hand was still warm from my pocket when everything went wrong. I'm telling you this because I need someone else to know. Someone else to understand that what happened at Millbrook General Store wasn't just my mind playing tricks. The security footage, they say it doesn't exist. But I was there. I know what I saw and what I didn't see. Listen carefully, because after tonight you might start noticing things too, things that were always there. Waiting. The story begins now. Tuesday evenings in Millbrook, Vermont have a particular kind of quiet. The kind where you can hear your own breathing echo off the empty streets. I'd driven 40 minutes out of my way just to reach the old general store before it closed at 8. My girlfriend Sarah had been craving those maple honey cookies they made fresh every morning. The ones wrapped in brown paper with twine. The kind of detail that mattered when you were trying to fix a relationship hanging by a thread. The GPS had taken me down Route 108, past the abandoned Sinclair farm, through patches of forest so thick the headlights barely cut through. When I finally saw the wooden sign for Millbrook General Store, hand-painted and swaying in the October wind, relief washed over me like cold water. I parked next to the only other car in the lot, a rusty Ford pickup that looked like it hadn't moved in years. The store's windows glowed amber against the darkness. Through the glass I could see shelves packed with preserves. Local honey, handmade soaps, exactly the kind of place Sarah would love. The bell above the door rang once, clear and sharp. Then silence. Hello? My voice cracked slightly. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of yellow that makes you look sick. The cash register sat at the far end, an ancient thing with real metal keys. Behind it, rows of cigarettes and lottery tickets. Normal. Everything normal, except for the smell. Have you ever walked into a room and known, just known, that something was off? It wasn't a bad smell exactly. More like when you open a jar that's been sealed too long. Sweet and stale at the same time. Be right with you, the voice came from somewhere in the back. Male, older, tired. I grabbed a basket and started shopping. The maple cookies were exactly where I'd remembered. Third aisle, bottom shelf. I picked up 2 packages. Then some Vermont cheddar. A jar of blackberry preserves, local beer, playing the part of the thoughtful boyfriend, even though Sarah and I both knew we were past saving. The shopkeeper appeared as I was reading the label on some apple butter. He moved wrong. That's the only way I can describe it. Like someone had taught him how to walk but forgot to mention the small things. The way weight shifts. The natural sway of arms. He was maybe 60, gray stubble, plaid shirt tucked into jeans. Normal, but his eyes were the color of old pennies. Finding everything, he smiled, and I noticed his teeth were perfect, too perfect. Like dentures, but newer somehow. Yeah, thanks. I held up the basket, just grabbing some local stuff. He nodded slowly, too slowly. First time in Millbrook? No, I've been through before. My girlfriend loves your maple cookies. Ah. He turned and walked back toward the register. That strange mechanical walk. Those are popular. I followed him, adding a few more items as I went. Beef jerky, trail mix. The kinds of things you buy when you're stalling. When you don't want to go back to an empty apartment and think about why Sarah hadn't returned your calls in 3 days. At the register, he rang everything up on the ancient machine. Each key press echoed in the empty store. Chunk, chunk, chunk. That'll be $47.53. I pulled out my wallet. The 20 was there, plus 2 10s and a 5. I handed him 3 bills. The 20 on top. Washington's face stared up at us from the counter. Out of 50. He opened the register drawer. The bills inside were sorted perfectly, facing the same way, crisp. $2.47 is your change. He counted it out. 2 ones, a quarter, 2 dimes, 2 pennies. His fingers moved precisely, mechanically, placing each coin in my palm without touching my skin. That's when I noticed the photo taped to the wall behind him, black and white, faded. A group of men standing in front of the store. The sign above them read Millbrook General Store, 1952. "Family photo?" I asked, pocketing the change. He turned to look. When he turned back, his smile was different. Wider. You could say that. The lights flickered. Just once. Quick enough that I almost missed it. "Would you like a bag?" He was already reaching under the counter. "Sure, thanks." The paper bag crinkled as he loaded my items. Cookies first, then the preserves, nested carefully so they wouldn't break. The kind of attention you'd expect from someone who'd been doing this for decades. "Drive safe." He pushed the bag across the counter. "Road gets tricky after dark." I grabbed the bag, turned toward the door, took 3 steps. The bell rang behind me. I spun around. The counter was empty. Not just empty, abandoned. Like no one had been there for hours. The register drawer hung open. My change was scattered across the counter, but the bills I'd given him were gone. "Hello?" My voice echoed off the walls. "Sir?" The lights hummed. The clock on the wall ticked. 7:47 p.m. I set the bag down and walked back to the counter. Leaned over to look behind it. Nothing, no door, no place someone could duck down, just worn linoleum and dust bunnies. "This isn't funny." I said it louder, anger covering the fear that was starting to creep up my spine. "I know you're here." Silence. I walked down the first aisle. Canned goods and pasta, empty. Second aisle, cereals and baking supplies, empty. Third aisle, where I'd found the cookies, empty. The store wasn't that big, maybe 2,000 square feet. There was a door marked "Employees Only" at the back. I pushed through it. The stockroom was cramped. Boxes stacked to the ceiling. It smelled stronger back here. That sweet stale smell that made my stomach turn. A single bulb swung from a chain, sending shadows dancing across the walls. "Sir, are you okay?" I navigated between the boxes. "Do you need help?" At the far end, another door, this one metal. Painted green, but flaking. A padlock hung from the latch, but it was open. Dangling, like someone had left in a hurry. I shouldn't have opened it. Every instinct told me to leave. Take my groceries and go, drive back to Burlington and forget this ever happened. But I kept thinking about how he'd vanished, how it was impossible, how there had to be an explanation. The door opened onto stairs, wooden, old. They groaned under my weight as I descended into darkness. The temperature dropped 10 degrees with each step down. My phone's flashlight barely penetrated the darkness, like the black was thick, substantial. The smell grew stronger. Sweet rot mixed with something chemical, something that burned the back of my throat. The stairs ended at a dirt floor. The basement stretched out beyond my light's reach. I could make out shapes, furniture covered in sheets, boxes stacked against stone walls. Normal basement things. Except for the humming, low, electrical, but wrong somehow. Like a frequency that wasn't meant for human ears. "Hello?" My voice came out as a whisper. I cleared my throat, tried again. "I'm looking for the shopkeeper. Are you down here?" The humming stopped. In the silence I heard breathing. Not mine. Slower, deeper, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I swept my phone's light across the room. The beam caught something that made me step back. Photographs, hundreds of them, tacked to every inch of the far wall, all black and white, all the same group of men in front of the store. But as I moved closer, I realized they weren't the same photo. The men were in different positions, different clothes, different seasons visible through the store windows behind them. But their faces never changed, never aged. The same 6 men standing in the same order, spanning what had to be decades. The one on the far right looked familiar. Gray stubble, plaid shirt. Those strange copper eyes staring directly at the camera in every single photo. My phone buzzed. Sarah calling. The screen's brightness blinded me for a second. When my eyes adjusted, I wasn't alone anymore. He stood between me and the stairs. The shopkeeper, but different. His movements were smoother now, more natural. Like whatever had been pretending to be human had given up the act. You shouldn't be down here. His voice was still tired, still old, but there was something underneath it now, an echo, like multiple people speaking in unison. I was looking for you. I kept my phone pointed at him. The light made his eyes shine like a cat's. You disappeared. Did I? He tilted his head, or did you just stop seeing me? What's that supposed to mean? He smiled. Those two perfect teeth caught the light. How long do you think you've been down here? I glanced at my phone. 8:23 p.m. That couldn't be right. I'd been in the store at 7:47, the basement for maybe 5 minutes. Time moves differently in some places. He took a step closer. I backed up until I hit the wall of photographs. Especially places that have been here, waiting. Waiting for what? For someone to notice, another step, to really see. Most people come in, buy their things, leave. They don't look, don't question. But you, he smiled wider. You had to know. The photographs behind me rustled. I glanced back. They were changing. The men in the photos were turning. Slowly, all of them. Turning to look at whoever was taking the picture. Turning to look at me. We've been here so long. His voice was definitely multiple voices now. Harmonizing. Since before the store, before the town, waiting in the spaces between, the moments people don't pay attention to. You're crazy, but my voice shook, because the photos were still changing, the men stepping closer to the camera, their faces becoming clearer, and they all looked like him, different ages, different eras, but the same copper eyes. Am I? He was close enough now that I could smell him, that sweet stale smell that made my eyes water. Tell me, what did you do with those 3 seconds? What? Between putting your items on the counter and me appearing, 3 seconds, where did they go? I tried to remember, tried to picture it, but there was nothing, a gap, like a record skip. That's where we live. He reached out. His hand moved in stutters, like a film missing frames. In the spaces between moments, the pauses people don't notice. We've been feeding on them for so long, but it's not enough anymore. His fingers were inches from my face when my phone rang again. Sarah. The ringtone shattered whatever spell had been building. I ducked under his arm and ran for the stairs. He didn't chase me, just laughed. A sound like wind through empty rooms. I took the stairs 3 at a time. Burst through the stockroom. The store was different now, darker. The shelves seemed taller, the aisles longer. I could hear him behind me. Not footsteps, that rustling sound. Like the photographs coming alive, the front door was locked. I pulled, pushed, slammed my shoulder against it. The glass didn't even rattle. You can't leave. His voice came from every aisle at once. Not until you give them back. Give what back? The moments you stole. The seconds you weren't paying attention. They belong to us. The lights went out. Complete darkness. Just the glow of my phone screen. Sarah's face smiling up at me from the missed call notification. God, I missed her. Missed the way she laughed at my stupid jokes. The way she hummed while cooking. All the little moments I'd taken for granted. That's when I understood. Those moments, the ones we don't notice, the spaces between breaths, the pause before a kiss, the second of silence before laughter. That's what they wanted, what they fed on. I'll make you a deal, I spoke to the darkness. I'll give you what you want, but you let me go. Silence, then, show us. I closed my eyes, thought about all the moments I'd wasted, the times I'd been on my phone while Sarah talked about her day, the dinners eaten in silence, the walks where I'd been somewhere else entirely. All those precious seconds I'd let slip away without noticing. I felt them leave me, pulled out like threads from a sweater, each one a small death, a tiny goodbye to something I'd never get back. When I opened my eyes, I was standing in the parking lot, my car keys in my hand, the bag of groceries at my feet. The store was dark, closed, like it had been for hours. I drove home in silence, called Sarah from the parking lot of my apartment. "Hey," her voice was warm, concerned. "I've been trying to reach you. I know, I'm sorry, How could I explain? I got lost. Are you okay?" "Yeah, I missed you." She paused. I could picture her, curled up on her couch, twirling her hair the way she did when she was thinking. "I missed you too." We talked for an hour, really talked, like we hadn't in months, about nothing, about everything, making up for all those lost moments. But here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. The next morning, I Googled Millbrook General Store. Nothing. No website, no reviews, no mention of it anywhere. I drove back out Route 108, followed the same path. But where the store had been, there was just an empty lot, overgrown with weeds, a rusty chain blocking the entrance. I asked around Burlington. No one had heard of it. The maple cookies I'd bought, the bag was still in my car, but it was empty, like I'd carried home a bag of air. Sarah and I got back together. We're good now, better than before. I pay attention to every moment, every pause, every breath between words, because I know what happens to the ones we waste. But sometimes, usually around 7:47 p.m., I feel it. That sensation of being watched, of something waiting in the spaces I'm not looking. And I wonder, when I gave them those moments, did I give them away back? Last week, I was at a gas station in Montpelier, paying for coffee. The cashier, a teenager with gauges and purple hair, counted my change, placed it in my palm without touching my skin, and for just a second, just a fraction of a moment, his eyes flashed copper. I ran, left the coffee, left the change, got in my car and drove until my hand stopped shaking. But I know it's not over, because here's what I figured out, what I think they wanted me to know all along. They're not confined to that store. They never were. They're in every transaction, every moment of exchange where attention slips. The second you look away while the barista makes your latte. The pause while waiting for your credit card to process. The space between thank you and have a nice day. They're spreading. And the worst part, I think I helped them. By noticing, by acknowledging they exist, by telling this story, which brings me to why I'm sharing this with you. 2 nights ago, I was paying for groceries at the Market Basket on Pine Street, normal Tuesday night, normal tired cashier, normal everything. Until she handed me my receipt. Her fingers brushed mine, just barely, but enough for me to see her eyes flicker. Copper to brown and back again. "Have a nice night," she smiled. Perfect teeth, too perfect. I sat in my car for an hour, watching through the window, counting how many people went through her line. How many tiny moments of contact, how many opportunities to spread. Whatever this is. I should have warned them, should have done something. But who would believe me? Who believes any of this? You do, or you wouldn't still be listening. So here's my warning. Next time you're paying for something, anything, pay attention. Really look at the person helping you. Watch their movements, their eyes, the way they count change. Because if you see what I've been seeing, if you notice that wrongness, that mechanical precision trying to mimic human behavior, don't run. That just confirms you can see them. Instead, hold the moment. Every second of it. Don't let your attention wander. Don't give them any gaps to slip through. Make the transaction last. Ask questions. Count your change twice. Anything to stay present. Stay aware. Because the moment you look away, the second your mind drifts, that's when they take root. That's when you become like me, seeing them everywhere, knowing they're spreading, unable to do anything but watch and warn and hope someone listens. I need to tell you about yesterday. Sarah and I were at a farmer's market in Waterbury. Sunny Saturday morning. The kind of perfect October day that makes you forget darkness exists. She was laughing at something. I can't remember what, her hand in mine. Everything good and normal and right. Then I saw him, the shopkeeper, standing behind a table of apple cider. Same gray stubble, same plaid shirt, same copper eyes. But younger somehow. Like the photographs in reverse. Sarah didn't notice when I stopped walking. Didn't notice when my hand slipped from hers. She kept moving through the crowd while I stood frozen, watching him serve customers. That same mechanical precision, that same too-perfect smile. He saw me watching, nodded, held up a paper cup of cider like a toast. I found my voice. "Sarah," she turned back. "What's wrong? We need to go." "But we just got here." She looked where I was staring. "Oh, fresh cider. Let's get some." "No." I grabbed her arm. Too hard. She pulled away. "Jake, what is going on with you?" I couldn't explain. How could I? Your boyfriend thinks the apple cider vendor is some kind of moment-stealing entity? That sounds stable. Please. I was begging now. Please, just trust me. She must have seen something in my face, fear, maybe, or madness. Because she nodded. Let me lead her back to the car. But I saw the way she looked at me, the distance already growing. In the car, I tried to explain, told her everything. The store, the basement, the photographs, the way they lived in the spaces between moments. She listened, nodded, asked careful questions. The kind you ask when someone you love might be having a breakdown. Maybe you should talk to someone. Her voice was gentle. This stress with us, with work, it's a lot. I'm not crazy. I didn't say you were. But she was already pulling away. I could feel it, see it in the spaces between her words, the pauses that used to be comfortable now filled with doubt. That was yesterday. This morning, she called to say she needs some time, some space, to think about things, about us. I wanted to fight, to beg, to make her understand, but I just said okay, because what else could I do? I've been driving all day, through every small town in Vermont, checking every store, every market, every place where money changes hands, and I see them, more each time. Different faces but the same eyes, the same wrong movements. They're not hiding anymore. At a gas station in Woodstock, the attendant. At a diner in Killington, the waitress. At a bookstore in Manchester, the owner. All of them moving like puppets learning to be real. All of them with those copper penny eyes. And the worst part, no one else notices. People hand over their money, accept their change, move on with their lives, blind to what's happening right in front of them. But you notice now, don't you? Now that I've told you. Now that you know what to look for. You'll see them too, at your coffee shop tomorrow morning, at the grocery store, at the gas pump, anywhere money changes hands, anywhere attention slips. I'm parked outside that empty lot in Millbrook now, where the store should be, writing this on my phone, hoping someone will read it, will understand, will know what to do because I'm out of ideas, out of hope, out of moments to give. The sun is setting. 7:47 p.m. according to my phone. The same time I walked into that store. The same time everything changed, and in the dying light, I can see it. The outline of the building, faint like a shadow of something that was, or something that's trying to be again. I'm going inside. If you're reading this, If you've made it this far, then you know what to look for, you know what to avoid. Don't let your attention wander. Don't give them the spaces between. And whatever you do, don't come looking for me, because I finally understand what they want, why they're spreading, why they needed someone to notice, to tell others, to make more people aware. They're not feeding on our lost moments anymore. They're feeding on our fear of losing them, on the constant vigilance, the paranoia, the need to watch every second, to never let our guard down. They've turned attention itself into a prison, and I helped them build it. The door is opening now. I can see him standing behind the counter, waiting, patient, like he has all the time in the world. Because he does. He has all the stolen moments, all the spaces between, all the time we'll never get back. Welcome back. I can hear him even from here. That tired voice, that echo underneath. Did you bring what you owe us? I know what he means now. The moments I've been hoarding, clinging to, every second with Sarah, every precious pause, every breath between words. I've been holding them so tight, afraid to let them go, afraid to lose them like I lost all the others. But that's the trap. The real horror. It's not about what they take, it's about what we refuse to give. Love isn't about holding on to every moment, it's about trusting that there will be more. That the spaces between aren't empty. They're full of possibility, of the next laugh, the next touch, the next perfect ordinary moment we don't need to document or hoard or fear losing. I'm walking toward the store now. The gravel crunches under my feet, real, solid, present. The door is open. The lights are on. That familiar amber glow. But I'm not afraid anymore, because I know the secret. The way to beat them. The thing they don't want you to know. Let go. Let the moments pass. Let your attention wander. Let life flow around you and through you without trying to catch every drop. Because the tighter you hold on, the more you feed them. The more you become like them. Mechanical. Precise. Going through the motions without feeling. I'm inside now. He's smiling at me from behind the counter. Those copper eyes almost kind. Ready to pay your debt? I nod, close my eyes and let go. Every hoarded moment. Every stolen second with Sarah. Every pause I've been guarding, I let them flow out of me like water, like breath, like life. And in return, I get something else. Something I didn't expect. Peace. The store fades. The shopkeeper fades. Everything fades except this moment, this exact moment. Sitting in my car, in an empty lot, typing the last words of a story that might be true, or might be madness, or might be something in between. My phone rings. Sarah. Hey. Her voice is warm, worried. Where are you? I look around. The lot is empty. Just weeds and broken asphalt. I got lost again. Come home. Simple words. But they hold everything. Just come home. Okay. I start the car, drive away from Millbrook, from whatever was or wasn't there. From the shopkeeper and his copper eyes and his patient, terrible smile. But I know he's still out there. In every store, every transaction. Every moment we're not paying attention. Waiting, feeding, growing. And now you know too. You can't unknow it, can't unsee it. Every time you pay for something, every time you hand over money and wait for change, you'll wonder, is this one of them? Are those eyes too bright? Are those movements too precise? You'll pay attention, guard every moment, watch every second. And that's exactly what they want. Sweet dreams. Tell me, have you noticed anyone strange at your local store lately? Someone whose movements seem just a little too perfect? Whose smile doesn't quite reach their copper-colored eyes? Share your story in the comments below. Like this video if you'll be paying closer attention from now on. And subscribe, because the spaces between stories are where the real horrors live. And I have so many more to share with you. Remember, they're always watching, always waiting, in the moments you're not. Story number 3. The scratching started on a Tuesday. Not Monday, never Monday. That's what bothers me most about this whole thing. If it had started on a Monday, I could have blamed it on stress from work. The beginning of another long week at the insurance office in downtown Denver. But Tuesday? Tuesday was supposed to be my easy day. I remember standing in my kitchen, stirring instant coffee in my favorite mug, the one with the chip on the handle, when I heard it. A soft, deliberate scratching coming from somewhere behind the refrigerator. Not the quick skittering of mice. This was slower, more purposeful. Great, I muttered to myself, just what I need. The house on Maple Street had been a steal. A 1920s craftsman that the realtor Janet had practically begged me to take. It's been on the market for 8 months, she'd said, her smile a little too bright. The previous owners just left, said they found a better opportunity out of state. I should have asked more questions, but I was 32, recently divorced, and desperate to start over. The exposed brick walls and original hardwood floors had sold me instantly. Plus, the basement had already been converted into a home office, perfect for my freelance writing on weekends. But now there was scratching. I pulled the refrigerator away from the wall, expecting to find mouse droppings or maybe a nest. Instead, I found a small hole, about the size of a quarter, perfectly drilled through the drywall. The edges were smooth, deliberate, and deep inside that darkness, I swear I saw something move. "Okay," I said aloud, needing to hear my own voice. "Okay, Sarah, it's just mice. Call an exterminator tomorrow." But that night, as I lay in bed scrolling through my phone, I heard it again, this time from the bedroom wall. The same slow, methodical scratching, like someone, or something, was trying to communicate. I pressed my ear against the wall. The scratching stopped immediately. Then I heard breathing. Soft, rhythmic breathing that wasn't mine. My heart hammered as I pulled back, staring at the wall like it might suddenly sprout eyes. The breathing continued for exactly 3 minutes. I know because I watched the red numbers on my alarm clock, then stopped. The next morning, I called in sick to work. Spent the entire day at Home Depot, buying every possible tool to investigate. Stud finder, flashlight, even one of those little cameras on a flexible cable that plumbers use. The cashier, a kid named Tyler with gauge earrings, gave me a weird look. "Doing some renovations?" he asked. "Something like that," I muttered, swiping my credit card. Back home, I started with the kitchen. Used the stud finder along the wall where I'd found the hole. The device beeped normally at first, showing the regular pattern of studs every 16 inches. But then it went crazy. The digital display showed solid mass for nearly 3 feet, right in the middle of what should have been empty space. "That's not possible," I whispered. I drilled a tiny hole, just big enough for the camera. My hands shook as I fed the cable through, watching the grainy display on the small screen. At first, just darkness and insulation. Then the camera emerged into a space. An actual room between my kitchen wall and what should have been the exterior of my house. And in that room, furniture. Tiny furniture. A miniature table, chairs, even what looked like a small bed, all of it old, covered in dust, but arranged with care. Like someone had been living there, my throat went dry. I pulled the camera back so fast I nearly dropped it. That's when I heard the voice, soft, muffled, coming from inside the wall. "She found the viewing hole, Papa," a child's voice, a little girl. I stumbled backward, knocking over my coffee mug. It shattered on the floor, brown liquid spreading across the white tiles. The voice continued, joined by others now. Whispers. Urgent whispers. "She's not supposed to see yet. It's too early. Papa, what do we do?" And then a deeper voice, male, authoritative. "We wait. She's not ready." Ready for what? I ran. grabbed my purse and ran straight out the front door, not stopping until I reached my car. My hands fumbled with the keys as I looked back at my house, my beautiful craftsman house, and saw movement in the upstairs window. A small face, pale and wide-eyed, watching me from behind the curtain. But I lived alone. I drove to a motel on Colfax Avenue, the kind that rents by the hour but asks no questions. I spent the night staring at the water-stained ceiling, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Tried to convince myself it was stress, a hallucination. Maybe a gas leak causing me to see things. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I called my brother Marcus in Colorado Springs. He answered on the third ring, voice groggy. "Sarah, it's 7 in the morning. Marcus, I need you to come to Denver, today." "What's wrong?" I paused, knowing how insane it would sound. "There's something in my house, in the walls." "Like rats?" "No, not rats." Silence, then, "Sarah, are you using again?" My jaw clenched. One mistake 5 years ago, and he'd never let me forget it. "I'm clean, Marcus. Have been since rehab. This is different." Okay, I'll come up after work. Just stay calm, all right?" But I couldn't stay calm. Couldn't stop thinking about those voices. That furniture, the child's face in my window. I spent the day at the library researching my house. Found old newspaper articles on microfilm dating back to when it was built. Normal stuff at first. Building permits, property transfers. Then I found an article from 1978 that made my blood run cold. Local family missing, feared dead. The article showed a photograph. A family of 4, parents and 2 children, standing in front of my house. The Walkers. David and Patricia Walker and their kids Emma and James. They'd vanished without a trace. No bodies ever found. The house sat empty for 2 years before being sold. But it was the last paragraph that really got me. Neighbors reported strange sounds coming from the Walker home in the weeks before their disappearance. Mrs. Gladys Murphy, who lived next door, claimed to hear voices and movement inside the walls. Police found no evidence of foul play. I printed the article, my hands trembling. Checked out 3 books on the history of Denver architecture, specifically about hidden rooms and passages in old houses. Apparently, during Prohibition, many homes had secret spaces for hiding alcohol. Some were never properly sealed. When Marcus finally arrived that evening, I was sitting on my front porch, afraid to go inside. "You look terrible," he said, climbing out of his truck. "Thanks, really helpful." He sat beside me, and I told him everything. Showed him the article. His expression grew more concerned with each detail. "Okay," he said finally. "Let's go inside, together." "Marcus, no." "Sarah, either you're having a breakdown, in which case I need to help you, or something really weird is happening. In which case, I still need to help you. Come on." We entered through the front door. The house felt different. Warmer than it should have been. And there was a smell, like old flowers and something else. Something sweet and cloying. "Do you smell that?" I whispered. Marcus nodded, his confidence wavering. "Yeah? What is that?" The scratching started immediately, but this time, it wasn't just from one wall, it surrounded us. Every wall, the ceiling, even seeming to come from beneath the floorboards. A symphony of scratching like dozens of fingernails on wood. "What the hell?" Marcus breathed. Then the lights went out. In the darkness, we heard them clearly. Footsteps. Not in the walls anymore, but in the house with us. Small feet pattering across the hardwood, larger ones following. A family's worth of footsteps moving through my home like they owned it. Marcus grabbed my arm. "We're leaving now." But as we turned toward the door, a figure stepped into the hallway. Illuminated by the streetlight filtering through the window, I saw her clearly. A little girl, maybe 7 or 8, wearing a dress that looked decades out of style. Her hair was long and tangled, her feet bare. She smiled at us. "You're home early, Mama." My legs nearly gave out. I'm not your... Emma? A woman's voice called from the kitchen. Emma, who are you talking to? More footsteps. A woman appeared, followed by a man and a teenage boy, all of them pale, thin, wearing clothes from another era. The Walker family. The missing Walker family. But they weren't looking at us. They were looking through us. Nobody, Mama, Emma said, just practicing my letters on the wall. The woman smiled. That's nice, dear, but remember, we must be quiet. The people upstairs might hear. The people upstairs, they meant us. Marcus and I were the people upstairs. The family walked past us, close enough that I could see the patterns on the woman's dress, the scuff marks on the man's shoes. They headed toward the basement door, opened it, and descended. The door closed behind them with a soft click. Marcus and I stood frozen for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Then we ran, burst out the front door, and didn't stop until we were in his truck, speeding away. Did you? I couldn't form words. Yeah, Marcus said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. I saw. We went to his apartment, spent the night researching, calling anyone who might help. Found a professor at DU who specialized in paranormal research, Dr. Elizabeth Henley. She agreed to meet us the next day. You're not the first, she said over coffee at a small cafe on Broadway. Houses with hidden spaces. Sometimes they develop their own ecosystems, their own realities. What does that mean? I asked. She leaned forward. Think of it like parallel dimensions, but localized. The Walker family, they might have discovered these spaces, started living in them, and over time, the boundary between their world and ours became fluid. That's insane, Marcus said. Is it? Dr. Henley pulled out a folder. I've documented 17 cases in Colorado alone, families who vanish but never really leave. They exist alongside the new residents, occupying the same space but in different layers of reality. So, they're ghosts? No, they're very much alive, just displaced, living in the spaces between spaces. How do I get them out? I asked. Dr. Henley's expression turned grave. You don't. Once a house develops these parallel spaces, they're permanent. The question is, can you coexist? That night, against all logic, I went home, alone. Marcus tried to stop me, but I needed answers. The house was quiet when I entered. I stood in the living room and spoke to the walls. I know you're there, the Walkers. I want to understand. Silence. Then, slowly, a section of wall near the fireplace swung inward. A hidden door I'd never noticed. Emma stood there, no longer see-through, looking as solid and real as anyone. Papa says you're ready now, she said, extending her small hand. Would you like to see our home? I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I took her hand. The passage beyond was narrow, lit by old oil lamps. It opened into a network of rooms I couldn't comprehend. Spaces that shouldn't exist, carved between and behind my walls. Some were furnished like a home from the 1970s. Others were older, much older, with furniture from the 1920s or earlier. We're not the first, Emma explained as we walked. Families have been living here long before us. The house, it makes room for everyone. We emerged into a larger space, a dining room where the rest of the Walkers sat at a table. They looked up as we entered, and Patricia Walker smiled. Welcome, she said. We've been waiting for you to find us. The house told us you were special. The house told you? David Walker nodded. It speaks to those who listen, shows them the spaces between. We found them by accident, exploring during renovations. And we realized, why live in just one layer when there are so many? But the article said you disappeared. People thought you were dead. We chose to step sideways, Patricia said. Away from mortgages and jobs and all the noise. Here, time moves differently. We age slower. We want for nothing. How many are there? Families, I mean. 3 others. deeper in, the Johnsons from 1952, the Kowalskis from 1933, and the original builders, the Carsons. All of us, living in our own layers, occasionally crossing paths. My head spun. "This is impossible." James, the teenage boy, finally spoke. "Is it? You've felt it, haven't you? The pull of the walls, the comfort of the spaces between. The house chooses its residents carefully." He was right. Despite everything, I felt safe here. Welcomed. Like I'd found something I didn't know I was looking for. "What happens now?" I asked. "That's up to you," David said. "You can live upstairs, pretending we don't exist. Or you can join us. Not permanently, not at first, just visit. Learn about the spaces. The house has so much to show you." I spent hours with them, learned about their daily routines, how they gathered food from some inexplicable source within the walls, how they entertained themselves with books and games that seemed to materialize as needed. The children attended a schoolroom where lessons wrote themselves on the walls. "The house provides," Patricia explained. "It always has." When I finally returned to my normal living room, dawn was breaking. But only an hour had passed on my clock. Marcus called. "Sarah, are you okay? You haven't answered your phone all night." I looked at my phone. 17 missed calls. But I'd only been gone an hour. "I'm fine," I said. I'm going to stay." "What?" "Sarah, no, those things. They're not things, they're people, families. And Marcus, they're not trapped, they're free." He argued, pleaded, even threatened to call the police. But what would I tell them? That families from decades past lived in my walls, in spaces that physics said couldn't exist. That was 3 months ago. I still live in the house on Maple Street, still go to work, pay my bills, live my normal life. But now, when I hear scratching in the walls, I know it's just Emma practicing her letters. When I smell those strange flowers, I know Patricia is making her special tea. Sometimes I join them for dinner. Sometimes they join me for movie night, flickering in and out of visibility on my couch. We've found a balance, a rhythm. Last week I met the Johnsons. They showed me their section, decorated in perfect 1950s style. Mrs. Johnson makes the best apple pie I've ever tasted, though I can't explain where she gets the apples. The Kowalskis keep to themselves mostly, but their daughter, Maria, sometimes plays piano, a piano that exists only in the spaces between. The music drifts through my walls at night, beautiful and impossible. I haven't met the Carsons yet. They stay in the deepest spaces, the oldest ones. But sometimes I feel them watching, evaluating. Emma says they're waiting to see if I'm truly one of them. My brother doesn't visit anymore. My coworkers think I've become a hermit. But I've never been less alone. The house on Maple Street has many layers, many families, many stories. And now, one of them is mine. But here's what keeps me up at night. Not the scratching, not the footsteps, not even the impossible physics of it all. It's the notebook I found hidden in my bedroom wall last week. My notebook. The one I'm writing in right now. Except the pages were aged, yellow, and brittle, like they'd been there for decades. And the last entry, in my own handwriting, said, "I've decided to step sideways permanently. The walls are calling and I must answer. If someone finds this, know that I made this choice freely. The families are waiting for me. They've always been waiting." I haven't written those words. Not yet. But lately, when I look in the mirror, I swear my reflection moves a half-second too late. And sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I see another me walking through my house. A me that's already made the choice. The walls are calling, every day, a little louder. So, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Those of you listening to this right now, comfortable in your homes, surrounded by your walls. Do you ever hear them whisper? Do you ever wonder what's in the spaces you can't see? Because the house on Maple Street isn't unique. The walkers told me that. These spaces exist everywhere, in old houses and new ones, waiting for someone to notice, waiting for someone to listen. So, tell me, have you checked your walls lately? Have you noticed the scratching? Because once you hear it, really hear it, the walls never stop calling. And one day, you might just answer. One day, you might just step sideways, into the spaces between, where we're all waiting for you. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to know what happened after I found that notebook. What happened when I started paying attention to the other signs. It began with the mail. Letters addressed to Sarah Chen, my name, but postmarked from 1987, 1993, 2001. All different years, but all in my handwriting. The postal worker, Janet, just shrugged when I asked about it. Sometimes old mail gets lost in the system, she said. But her eyes darted away when she said it, like she knew something. The letters were mundane at first. Grocery lists, reminders about dentist appointments, notes to myself, but they were for appointments I'd never made, at places that didn't exist anymore. Dr. Morrison's office on 3rd Street, except 3rd Street had been renamed MLK Boulevard in 1995. Then came the photographs. I found them slipped under my door one morning. Polaroids, the old kind with the white borders. Pictures of me at different ages, in rooms of my house I'd never seen. Me at maybe 40, sitting in a parlor with Victorian furniture. Me at 50, gray-streaked hair, laughing with people I didn't recognize. Me at 70, ancient and thin, standing in front of a wall covered in children's drawings. But I'm only 32. Marcus had stopped taking my calls by then. My friend Lisa tried to stage an intervention, convinced I was having a breakdown. She sat in my living room fidgeting with her coffee mug while I tried to explain. "Sarah, honey, you need help. This isn't normal." "Define normal," I said. "Is it normal that we accept only one layer of reality? That we ignore all the spaces we can't see? You're scaring me." I wanted to show her, wanted to take her hand and lead her through the hidden door by the fireplace. But when I looked, it wasn't there. The house had sealed it. "She's not ready," Emma's voice whispered from inside the wall. "The house knows." Lisa left quickly after that. Probably heard me talking to the wall. I haven't seen her since. But the house began revealing more as I spent time alone. New passages opened each night. I mapped them obsessively, filling notebooks with sketches and measurements that defied logic. Rooms that occupied the same space but different times. Hallways that led up when they should lead down. A library where the books wrote themselves. Stories of all the families who'd lived between the walls. That's where I learned the truth about the house's history. It wasn't built in 1920. It was built around something that was already there. The original foundation dated back to the 1850s, built by a man named Jeremiah Carson. He'd been an architect, but also something else. The books called him a dimensional engineer. He'd designed the house to exist in multiple layers of reality simultaneously. Each family that moved in created their own layer, their own version of the house. And sometimes, when the conditions were right, the barriers thinned. "We're not ghosts," David Walker explained one evening as we sat in their dining room, or my dining room, or both. "We're just living in a different frequency of the same space." "But why show yourselves to me?" Patricia smiled sadly. "Because you're already shifting, haven't you noticed? The way time moves differently for you now. The way people look through you sometimes. I had noticed. At work, colleagues would walk past my desk without seeing me. I'd have to tap them on the shoulder to get their attention. At the grocery store, I'd stand in line for 10 minutes before the cashier noticed me. "It's beginning," James said. "The house is claiming you." "I don't want to disappear," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure they were true. "Who says you're disappearing?" Emma asked. "You're just expanding, existing in more places at once." That night, I discovered the museum. It was through a door in my basement that I'd never seen before. Behind it, a vast space filled with artifacts from every family who'd lived in the walls. The Johnsons' 1950s television that played shows from alternate timelines. The Kowalskis' radio that picked up broadcasts from futures that might have been. And in the center, the Carsons' original blueprints for the house. But they weren't just blueprints, they were living documents, constantly redrawing themselves. I watched in fascination as new rooms appeared on the paper. Rooms I recognized from my explorations. And there, in the corner of the newest edition, my name appeared. S. Chen, transitional resident. Transitional, not permanent yet. I started experimenting after that. Learned I could step partially into the other layers. Have breakfast with the walkers while simultaneously getting ready for work in my own timeline. The skill grew stronger each day. My reflection became more unreliable. Sometimes it showed me at different ages. Sometimes it showed me in clothes I didn't own, in rooms I hadn't visited yet. Once, I saw myself standing with a family I didn't recognize, all of us translucent and smiling. "That's your future family," Patricia said when I told her. "Or one possible version. Time isn't linear in the spaces between. Will I have children? You already do in some layers. In others, you remain alone. In one, you're the grandmother to 17 grandchildren who all live in different frequencies of the house." My head spun trying to understand it. "How do you keep track?" "We don't," David laughed. "We just exist. Let the house sort out the details." But I needed to understand. I spent days in the museum, studying the artifacts. Found journals from residents going back over a century. All told the same story. The gradual pull of the walls, the thinning boundaries, the final choice to step sideways permanently. None of them regretted it. "The outside world is just one channel," Mrs. Johnson explained when I visited their 1950s lair. "We have access to all of them." She showed me how to tune into different realities using their old television. I saw versions of history where Denver developed differently, where my house was a mansion, a shop, a school. In one timeline, it was a hospital where a version of me worked as a nurse. "Is any of it real?" I asked. "All of it," Mr. Johnson said. "Every choice creates a new branch. The house contains them all." The Kowalskis finally invited me to their section. It was older, more formal, filled with Art Deco furniture and the smell of old books. Mr. Kowalski was a professor in his timeline, teaching at a university that existed only in certain layers. "The question," he said in accented English, "is not whether to join us. You've already begun. The question is whether to resist or embrace it." His daughter Maria played piano for me. The music was unlike anything I'd heard, notes that seemed to exist between the normal scale. It made me weep without knowing why. "The music of the spheres," she said. "You can only hear it from between spaces." But it was my first meeting with the Carsons that changed everything. They appeared in my bedroom one night, or I appeared in theirs. The boundaries had become so thin I couldn't tell anymore. Jeremiah Carson was a tall man with piercing gray eyes. His wife, Constance, moved with an otherworldly grace. "You're the one," Jeremiah said without preamble. "The one we've been waiting for." "I don't understand." "The house needs an anchor," Constance explained. "Someone who exists fully in multiple layers. Someone to help guide new residents through the transition. A bridge," Jeremiah added, "between the seen and unseen spaces." "Why me?" "Because you question, but don't reject. You fear, but don't flee. And most importantly," he gestured to the notebooks I'd filled with observations, "you document. You preserve. The house needs a historian." They showed me the deepest spaces then. rooms that existed outside normal time, libraries where every book that could be written existed simultaneously, gardens where seasons occurred all at once, a ballroom where all the families gathered for celebrations that lasted seconds and centuries. "This is your inheritance," Constance said. "If you choose to claim it." I returned to my normal bedroom dizzy with possibilities, but also terrified, because claiming it meant leaving the world I knew, meant becoming like them, visible only to those ready to see. The next day at work was when I knew my time was running out. I sat through a meeting where no one acknowledged me, sent emails that went unread. My boss walked through me, literally through me, on his way to the coffee machine. I was fading from their reality. That night, I called Marcus one last time. He answered, but his voice was distant. "Sarah? Is that? I can barely hear you." "I wanted to say goodbye," I said. "Goodbye? Where are you going?" I looked at the walls of my house, seeing all the layers at once now, all the families existing in their own frequencies, all the possibilities spread out like a vast tapestry. "Home," I said. "I'm going home." The call dropped. When I tried to redial, the number was disconnected. In this reality, Marcus's number had never existed. The walls were calling louder now, not scratching anymore, but singing. A harmony of all the families, all the timelines, welcoming me home. I stood in my living room, all the living rooms, and made my choice. "I'm ready," I said aloud. The house responded immediately. Every hidden door opened at once. Every passage revealed itself. The families emerged from their layers, solid and present, hands extended in welcome. "The final step," David Walker said, "is letting go of the illusion of a single reality." I took his hand, took all their hands, and stepped sideways for the last time. The transition was gentler than I expected, like sinking into warm water. The weight of linear time fell away. The constraints of single existence dissolved. I was 32 and 70 and not yet born. I was in my house and in all the houses that had ever stood on this spot. "Welcome home," the Carsons said in unison. And it was home. More home than any single layer had ever been. I exist fully in the spaces between now. I greet new residents when they arrive, help them understand the scratching in the walls. Some flee, some, like me, eventually join us. The house grows richer with each new family, each new layer of reality. But I still remember the single-layer world. Still document everything in notebooks that exist across multiple timelines. Sometimes I leave them where they can be found, like the one you're reading now, if you're reading it now, if now means anything anymore. Because here's the truth that the walls whisper: we're all living in layers already. We just pretend we're not. Every choice creates a new branch. Every possibility exists somewhere. The house on Maple Street just makes it visible. So when you hear scratching in your walls, when your reflection seems a bit off, when time moves strangely in certain rooms, remember this story. Remember that there are families waiting in the spaces between, waiting to show you wonders beyond single-layer existence. The walls are calling. They're always calling. And someday, if you're brave enough, or lonely enough, or curious enough, you'll answer. We'll be here when you do, all of us, in all our layers, in all our times, waiting in the spaces between, where reality is richer than you ever imagined, where home means something more than four walls and a roof, where families extend across dimensions and time is just another room to explore. The house on Maple Street has many stories. This has been mine, but it could be yours too. All you have to do is listen to the walls. All you have to do is step sideways. We're waiting for you. Story number 4. The crows remember everything. That's what my grandmother used to tell me whenever I'd throw rocks at them in her backyard in Portland, Maine. They'll remember your face, Danny, she'd warn, wagging her finger. And they'll tell their children about you. I thought it was just one of those things grandmothers say, like how sitting too close to the TV would ruin your eyes, or how cracking your knuckles would give you arthritis. But now I know she was right. The crows do remember, and they do so much more than that. If you're listening to this at night, maybe turn on a light. Check your window, make sure there aren't any dark shapes perched on the power lines outside, because once you know what I know, once you've seen what they can do, you'll never look at a crow the same way again. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you what happened last October. Let me tell you about the shapes they made. And if you make it to the end of this story, well, you'll understand why I haven't slept properly in months, why I flinch every time I hear a caw, why I moved across the country only to find that distance means nothing to them, because they're everywhere, and they're waiting. Now, let me tell you my story. It started with Mrs. Henderson's funeral. She lived 3 houses down from me in our quiet Portland neighborhood, one of those tree-lined streets where kids still rode bikes until the streetlights came on. Mrs. Henderson had fed the crows for 30 years. Every morning at 7 sharp, she'd shuffle out in her pink bathrobe with a bag of peanuts, tossing them onto her lawn while dozens of black birds descended from the massive oak trees. The whole neighborhood knew her routine. We'd joke about it at the annual block party. "There goes the crow lady," someone would say, and we'd all chuckle. But Mrs. Henderson would just smile that knowing smile of hers and say, "They're smarter than you think. Much smarter." She died on a Tuesday. Heart attack in her sleep, they said. Peaceful. The funeral was that Saturday, and I went mostly out of obligation. She'd been kind to me when I first moved to the neighborhood 5 years ago, bringing over a casserole and a list of local recommendations written in her spidery handwriting. The service was small, maybe 20 people. Her daughter flew in from Seattle, looking tired and guilty the way adult children do when they realize they didn't visit enough. The pastor gave a generic sermon about life and loss. Nothing memorable, but what happened at the cemetery that's burned into my brain forever. We were standing around the grave, that awkward moment when the casket has been lowered, but no one quite knows when it's okay to leave. The October air was crisp, leaves crunching under our feet. That's when I heard it. A single caw, then another, then dozens. I looked up. The trees surrounding Evergreen Cemetery were full of crows. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They sat in perfect silence after that initial chorus, just watching. The other mourners noticed too. People started shifting uncomfortably, pulling their coats tighter. "Mom always did love those birds," Mrs. Henderson's daughter said, trying to laugh. But it came out wrong. Forced. That's when they started moving. It wasn't random, it wasn't chaotic. The crows began flying from tree to tree in groups, landing in specific spots. From where I stood, I couldn't make sense of it at first. But Jimmy Chen, who worked at the cemetery and was standing on a hill about 50 yards away, he saw it clearly. I know because I heard him gasp. Heard him say, "Oh my God." The crows had formed letters. Perfect, readable letters spelled out in the trees. "We remember" people started backing away from the grave. The pastor dropped his Bible. Mrs. Henderson's daughter grabbed my arm so hard it left bruises. But the crows weren't done. They rose again. A black cloud swirling above us, their wings creating a sound like whispered secrets. Then they settled again. New formation. New message. She fed us. An elderly man I didn't know started praying under his breath. Someone else was filming with their phone, hands shaking so bad I doubt the footage was usable. Me? I just stood there, frozen, my rational mind trying to explain what couldn't be explained. Birds don't do this. Birds can't do this. But they were doing it. One final time they rose. The sound was deafening now, thousands of wings beating in unison. They circled 3 times, a perfect spiral, before settling into their final formation. Now we feed. Then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, they left. Not in a chaotic scatter, but in a single coordinated movement, like a theater curtain being drawn. Within seconds, the cemetery was silent except for our ragged breathing and someone quietly sobbing. We left quickly after that. Nobody spoke about it, but I saw the way people hurried to their cars, the way they kept glancing at the sky. At the reception, held in the church basement, conversation was stilted. The finger sandwiches went mostly untouched. People kept checking their phones, jumping whenever the old radiator clanked. I left early, telling Mrs. Henderson's daughter I had a work thing. She nodded, not really listening, her eyes distant and confused. As I walked to my car, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Every power line, every tree, every roof, crows. Silent and still, but watching, waiting. I drove home faster than I should have, running a yellow light that was definitely red by the time I crossed the intersection. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a full minute before getting out. My house looked different somehow. Darker. The shadows seemed deeper. That night I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe my brain was seeing patterns that weren't there. Maybe someone had trained them. I'd seen videos of crows solving puzzles, using tools. Maybe this was just an elaborate trick. But deep down, I knew better. What I'd witnessed wasn't a trick, it was something else, something that made my chest tight with a fear I couldn't name. I finally fell asleep around 3 a.m., my dreams full of black wings and messages I couldn't read. I woke to the sound of tapping. The tapping was coming from my bedroom window, steady, rhythmic, like someone knocking with a single knuckle. Tap, tap, tap. My alarm clock showed 7 a.m. exactly. Mrs. Henderson's feeding time. I lay there for a moment, telling myself it was just a branch. The old maple tree next to the house had been needing a trim. That's all it was. A branch in the wind. Tap, 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 but there was no wind. The curtains hung perfectly still. I got up slowly, my heart doing that thing where you can feel it in your throat. Walked to the window, took a breath, pulled back the curtain. A crow sat on the windowsill. Big one. Its black eye met mine, and I swear it looked intelligent, not bird smart, people smart. It tilted its head, studying me, then tapped the glass again with its beak. Tap, tap, tap. Behind it, on the power line, sat 20 more, all facing my window, all watching. I stumbled backward, the curtain falling closed. My hands were shaking. This was ridiculous. They were just birds. The tapping stopped. I waited 5 minutes before looking again. The windowsill was empty. The power line was empty, like they'd never been there at all. I tried to go about my normal Saturday, made coffee, checked emails, did some laundry, but I kept finding myself at windows, peering through the blinds. Every time I looked, nothing. Normal suburban Saturday, kids riding bikes, Mr. Patel mowing his lawn. Everything exactly as it should be. Maybe I'd imagined it. Stress from the funeral, lack of sleep. The mind plays tricks sometimes, right? That afternoon I decided to rake leaves. Physical activity would help clear my head. I put in my earbuds, cranked up some classic rock, and got to work. The October sun felt good on my back. The normalcy of the task was soothing. This was what Saturdays were for. Yard work, being productive, not thinking about impossible things. I was about halfway through the front yard when I noticed the silence. Not actual silence. I could still hear my music, but underneath it, nothing. No birds. No insects. Even with the music playing, there's always some background noise. But now, nothing. I pulled out my earbuds. The entire neighborhood was silent. No lawnmowers, no kids, no cars. Like someone had hit a mute button on the world. That's when I saw them. Every tree in my yard, every tree I could see covered in crows. They sat perfectly still, perfectly silent. Hundreds of them, thousands, all facing the same direction, all facing me. I dropped the rake. The clatter it made seemed obscenely loud in the silence. A few crows shifted at the sound, ruffling their feathers, but none flew away. They just watched. "What do you want?" I heard myself whisper. As if in answer, they began to move, not flying, walking, hopping from branch to branch, reorganizing themselves. I watched, transfixed, as they formed a shape in the massive oak tree directly in front of me. A face, Mrs. Henderson's face, perfect in its detail, the curve of her smile, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners, made entirely of living birds, each one a pixel in an impossible portrait. It lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then they scattered, filling the air with the sound of wings and caws, circling once before disappearing over the rooftops. I stood there for a long time after they left. Stood there until Mr. Patel came over to ask if I was all right. "You've been standing there for 20 minutes, he said, concern creasing his forehead, "just staring at that tree." I mumbled something about thinking I saw a rare bird. He didn't look convinced, but he let it go. "That's the suburban contract. We don't pry too deep. We maintain the polite fiction that everything is normal. But nothing was normal, not anymore. That night, I did something I hadn't done since grad school. Research. Real research. I dove into every database I could access. Ornithology journals, animal behavior studies, folklore, urban legends, anything about crows exhibiting unusual behavior. What I found made me wish I hadn't looked. Reports going back decades, centuries even. Always isolated incidents, always dismissed as misidentification or exaggeration. Crows forming shapes, crows delivering messages, crows appearing at significant moments, births, deaths, disasters. One account from 1892 particularly chilled me. A naturalist in Oregon reported seeing crows form letters and rudimentary images after the death of a local woman known for feeding them. His colleagues ridiculed him. He was stripped of his credentials. But his journal, which I found digitized in a university archive, contained detailed sketches. The shapes the crows had made. They were identical to what I'd seen at the cemetery. I pushed back from my laptop, rubbing my eyes. It was past midnight. The house felt too quiet, too empty. I made myself a drink, whiskey, neat, larger than I'd normally pour, and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the darkness. A movement caught my eye. The streetlight at the corner flickered, and in that moment of illumination I saw them. The power lines were full again. Every line as far as I could see. They sat in perfect rows, perfectly spaced, like notes on a musical staff. Were they always there now? Watching? Waiting? What were they waiting for? I closed all the blinds, double-checked the locks, took my drink to bed, and tried not to think about the fact that locks don't mean much when the threat has wings. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful. I dreamed of black feathers and Mrs. Henderson's voice saying, "They remember everything, Danny. Everything." I woke just before dawn to the sound of wings. Thousands of wings. The sound filled my house, seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. I lay there, paralyzed, as the sound grew louder, closer, then silence. When the sun finally rose, I found them. Black feathers, hundreds of them, arranged on my front porch in perfect letters. "You saw." That's when I knew. I was part of something now, something I didn't understand. Something I wasn't sure I wanted to understand. But the crows, they had other plans. I called in sick to work on Monday and Tuesday. By Wednesday, my boss was leaving concerned voicemails that I didn't return. How could I explain that I was afraid to leave my house? That every time I looked outside, they were there? Watching. Waiting. But staying inside wasn't helping. The crows had made that clear. Tuesday night, they'd covered my entire roof. I could hear them up there, thousands of little feet scratching against the shingles. The sound was maddening, like fingernails on a chalkboard, but inside your skull. I'd cranked up the TV, put on headphones, even tried running the vacuum just for the white noise. Nothing helped. Wednesday morning, they left another message. This time, formed by dead leaves arranged on my lawn, "Come outside." I knew I was losing it. The rational part of my brain kept screaming that this was impossible. Birds don't communicate with humans. Birds don't have agenda. Birds don't... But these weren't just birds anymore, or maybe they never were. That afternoon I finally cracked. I couldn't take the watching anymore. The waiting. If they wanted something from me, fine. Let's get it over with. I walked out my front door at exactly 3 p.m. The street was deserted. Funny how the neighbors had started avoiding walking past my house. Maybe they sensed something. Or maybe they'd seen the crows too and were doing what humans do best, pretending the scary thing doesn't exist. The moment I stepped onto the sidewalk, they appeared. Not aggressively, not threateningly. They simply landed around me in a perfect circle, about 10 feet in diameter. Big ones. Ravens mixed with the crows now, their larger forms interspersed among their smaller cousins like sergeants among soldiers. "What do you want?" I asked. My voice cracked. When was the last time I'd spoken out loud? One crow, larger than the rest with a few white feathers mixed into its black plumage, hopped closer. It had something in its beak. A photograph. It dropped the photo at my feet and backed away. I bent down, my hands trembling. The photo was old, edges yellowed. It showed Mrs. Henderson as a young woman, maybe in her 20s. She was standing in what looked like the same cemetery where we'd buried her, surrounded by crows. Dozens of them perched on her arms, her shoulders, even her head. And she was smiling. Not the polite smile of someone posing for a photo, but a real smile. Joy. I flipped the photo over. Written in that same spidery handwriting I recognized from her recipe cards. They chose me as speaker, now they choose you. The murders remember. The murders protect. The murders decide. Feed them. Learn their language. Or face their judgment. The murders. Plural. I thought it was just a clever name for a group of crows, but the way she'd written it... I looked up from the photo. The circle of birds remained perfectly still. Waiting. "I don't understand," I said. "I don't know what you want me to do." The white-feathered crow, I'd started thinking of it as the general, cawed once. The others echoed. Then they began to move. Not randomly, deliberately. They formed shapes on my lawn. Simple at first, a circle, a square, a triangle. They were teaching me. For the next 3 hours, I stood there as they showed me patterns, shapes, eventually simple pictographs. When I understood something, I'd nod, and they'd move on to the next lesson. When I was confused, they'd repeat it, slower, adding more detail. By sunset, I understood the basics. Shapes for concepts. Circle for gathering. Triangle for danger. Square for home. Wavy lines for water. Straight lines for path or direction. Combined, they could create complex messages. But understanding their language was just the beginning. As darkness fell, they showed me something else. Something that made my blood run cold. They formed a map. A perfect aerial view of our neighborhood, each crow representing a house. The pattern of their placement showing streets, the park, the small commercial district. And then they began marking locations. Crows would land in specific spots, caw a certain number of times, then fly away. Death locations. They were showing me where people had died. Car accidents, heart attacks, one murder from 5 years ago that had made the news. They knew. They remembered everything. But that wasn't the worst part. Some houses had multiple crows landing on them. Houses where people hadn't died. Yet, the general landed on 3. The Patel house, the Chen family, and mine. "No," I whispered. "No, you can't. You can't know that." The general tilted its head, studying me with that too intelligent eye. Then it flew to my shoulder. Its weight was surprising, claws gripping just hard enough to balance without breaking skin. It leaned close to my ear and made a sound I'd never heard a crow make before. Soft, almost like whispered words. Feed us, teach others, or we choose for ourselves. I know that's impossible. I know birds can't speak, but I heard it, clear as day. Inside my head more than through my ears, but I heard it. The general flew away and the others followed, dispersing into the growing darkness. I was left alone on my lawn, shaking, the photo of young Mrs. Henderson still clutched in my hand. I understood now. This wasn't just about feeding crows. This was about something ancient, a contract between species. The crows weren't just scavengers following death. They were, what? Predictors, preventers, or something worse? That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with a bag of peanuts and sunflower seeds waiting for dawn. Waiting to take up Mrs. Henderson's role. Because what choice did I have? They'd marked houses. They'd shown me the consequences of refusing. As the first light crept across the sky, I heard them gathering. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, converging on my yard. I grabbed the bag and walked outside. "Okay," I said to the waiting murders, "teach me the rest." What they showed me next changed everything. Because the crows weren't just intelligent. They were connected. All of them. Every crow in the city, the state, maybe the world. A network of black wings and dark eyes, sharing information instantly across vast distances. And now I was part of that network, whether I wanted to be or not. The first feeding was awkward. I scattered peanuts on my lawn while hundreds of crows watched, evaluating my technique. Too concentrated in one spot, and they showed their displeasure by forming an X on the ground. Too spread out, and they created wavy lines. Inefficient. Wasteful. It took a week to get it right. By then, the neighbors had definitely noticed. I'd see curtains twitch as I performed my morning ritual. Cars would slow down as they passed. But nobody said anything directly. That's not how suburbia works. We whisper, we gossip, we judge from a distance. But the crows were teaching me more than just how to feed them. Every day brought new lessons. They showed me how individual birds had personalities, histories, connections. The general, whose real name was a complex series of caws I couldn't replicate, had been alive for 23 years. Ancient for a crow. It had known Mrs. Henderson since she was middle-aged. It had watched her children grow up and move away. It had seen her husband's death coming 3 days before the stroke. That's what they did, I learned. They saw the patterns humans couldn't. The subtle changes in behavior, in smell, in the electromagnetic field every living thing generates. They knew when death was approaching. And sometimes, just sometimes, they could change its course. Mrs. Henderson had prevented 14 deaths over her 30 years as speaker. The crows would tell her, and she'd find ways to intervene. A casual conversation that kept someone from driving their usual route on the day of a would-be fatal accident. An anonymous tip about a gas leak. Small things that shifted fate just enough, but for every death prevented, the balance had to be maintained. The crows understood this in a way that made my human morality squirm. Death wasn't evil to them, it was necessary. Part of the pattern that kept the world functioning. Save too many, and the pattern broke. Save too few, and chaos crept in. They showed me this through elaborate formations, hundreds of birds creating moving pictures in the sky. I saw ecosystems collapse when predators were removed. I saw plagues spread when the weak weren't called. I saw the delicate balance they'd spent millions of years perfecting. And now, I was responsible for maintaining that balance in my small corner of the world. The first test came 2 weeks after I'd started feeding them. The crows marked the Chen house again, more urgently this time. Jimmy Chen, the same man who'd gasped at the cemetery, was going to die, heart attack. 3 days. I agonized over what to do. I barely knew Jimmy. We'd wave when we passed on the street, maybe chat about the weather. How could I tell him his heart was about to give out? How could I not? In the end, I chose the coward's way. An anonymous note in his mailbox urging him to see a doctor immediately, mentioning chest pains he hadn't told anyone about, symptoms the crows had observed and relayed to me through their complex pictographs. He went to the ER that night. Triple bypass surgery 2 days later. The surgeon said he was lucky. Another day or two, and it would have been too late. The crows showed their approval by leaving gifts. Shiny objects on my porch, coins, buttons, a gold ring someone had lost. But they also showed me the price. 3 nights later, they marked another house. Someone else would die instead. The balance maintained. I threw up when I realized what I'd done, saved one life at the cost of another. The crows watched me retch into my toilet with what I swear was disappointment. This was the burden of the speaker. This was why Mrs. Henderson had smiled that knowing smile. She'd carried this weight for 3 decades. But I was learning something else too. Something that terrified me more than the responsibility of choosing who lived and died. I was changing. My vision was sharper. I could spot individual crows from distances that should have been impossible. I understood their calls not just as communication, but as language. Complex, nuanced, beautiful. And late at night, when the murders roosted in the trees around my house, I could feel them. Their collective consciousness brushing against mine like silk scarves in a breeze. Thousands of minds linked together, sharing thoughts and memories across generations. They were showing me more now. Not just deaths, but the hidden patterns of the neighborhood. Affairs, secrets, crimes uncommitted but contemplated. The crows saw everything, and now they were sharing it with me. Mr. Patel was stealing from his employer. Small amounts, but consistent. The teenage girl 2 doors down was planning to run away. The couple at the end of the street were cooking something in their basement that wasn't food. All of this knowledge flowed into my mind through the crow network, unbidden and unstoppable. I started avoiding mirrors. My eyes were changing. Still brown, but with flecks of black that caught the light strangely. My hair, always dishwater blonde, had developed streaks of black that no amount of washing could remove. When I moved, I caught myself tilting my head like they did. Quick, jerky movements that let me see angles I'd never noticed before. 1 month after Mrs. Henderson's funeral, I understood the full truth. The speaker wasn't just a human who fed crows. The speaker was a bridge. Part human, part something else. Connected to the murder network in ways that transformed both species. Mrs. Henderson hadn't died of a heart attack. She'd chosen to end her time as speaker, and the crows had made it peaceful. A gift for 3 decades of service. Now it was my turn, and I could already feel the weight of years stretching ahead. But I was handling it wrong. The crows made that clear through increasingly complex messages. I was supposed to teach others, prepare them. The network needed multiple speakers spread across the world. One person couldn't maintain the balance alone. That's when they showed me the map again. Not just my neighborhood this time, the entire city. Points of light where potential speakers lived. People who'd shown kindness to crows. People who noticed patterns others missed. People who could handle the terrible burden of seeing death coming and choosing when to intervene. 13 candidates in Portland alone. They needed to be taught, prepared, recruited. I understood what they were asking. Spread the word, build the network, prepare humanity for something. The crows wouldn't show me what. Some knowledge was too dangerous even for a speaker, but I could feel it in their collective anxiety, the way they gathered in larger numbers, the urgency in their teachings. Something was coming, something that would require the ancient partnership between human and crow to be stronger than ever. So, I'm telling you this story, if you've made it this far. If you're still listening despite how impossible it sounds, then maybe you're one of them, one of the candidates. Maybe you've noticed crows watching you lately. Maybe you've seen strange patterns in their behavior. Don't be afraid, not of them at least. Be afraid of what happens if we don't listen, if we don't learn, if we don't accept our role in the balance they've spent millennia perfecting. The crows remember everything. They remember when humans and animals spoke the same language. They remember when we worked together, each species contributing to the whole. They remember, and they're trying to make us remember too, before it's too late. I feed them every morning now, 7 a.m. sharp, just like Mrs. Henderson. The neighbors have stopped pretending not to notice. Some watch openly, fascination replacing fear. A few have started leaving out peanuts of their own. The network is growing. Last week, the general brought me something new. Not a photo this time. A feather. Pure white, unlike anything from a crow or raven. It tingled when I touched it, sending visions flooding through my mind. Images of skies filled with more than just crows. Of patterns so vast and complex they made my human brain ache. Of changes coming that would require every speaker, every crow, every person who could see beyond the veil of normal reality. I keep that feather on my nightstand. Sometimes I wake to find crows perched on my windowsill, staring at it. Waiting, preparing. And if you're wondering whether this is all true, whether I've lost my mind or discovered something profound, well, look outside. Look at the crows, really look. See how they watch you. See how they move with purpose we've trained ourselves to ignore. They're waiting for you to notice, to understand, to remember. Because the crows remember everything. And soon, if they have their way, so will we. So tell me, have you noticed them watching you? Have you seen patterns in their movements? Strange formations? Messages meant just for you? Leave a comment below. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, because the network is growing. And we need all the speakers we can find. The crows are calling. Will you answer